Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know how this works? By now we take a topic and make you an expert in like 10 minutes.
That's the goal, at least.
And today, well, the word we're diving into is euphemism.
Ooh, euphemisms. Those are fun.
Right. I mean, we hear them all the time, but maybe don't think about them too hard.
Definitely more common than people realize.
So, to really get this deep dive going, we've got like dictionary stuff, some history of the word itself.
Oh, and even a YouTube video. Kind of a fun one, actually.
Exactly. By the end, you'll be spotting euphemisms left and right. And hey, maybe even using a few yourself.
Strategically, of course. Got to use them right.
So first things first, what even is a euphemism? Like, how do we define it?
Well, the dictionary is always a good starting point, right?
Yeah.
Merriam-Webster says a euphemism is when you take an expression that might be offensive or unpleasant.
Okay, yeah, I see where this is going.
And you swap it out for one that's more agreeable. You know, sounds nicer.
So basically, it's just saying something in a less harsh way.
Exactly. Like instead of saying someone died, we often say they passed away.
Oh yeah, classic example. That one's everywhere.
Totally. Or think about how many times you hear restroom instead of, well, you know, the other words.
Oh, for sure. It's already kind of blowing my mind how
Yeah.
often we use these things without even thinking about it.
Right. They're everywhere.
But like, where did this whole idea even come from? Like, why do we even do this word swapping thing?
Well, the word euphemism itself actually has a pretty interesting history.
Oh, lay it on me. I love a good word origin story.
It comes from the Greek word euphemia, which is made up of eu meaning good and pheme, which has to do with speech or prophecy.
So like, good speech. Makes sense, I guess.
And get this, the ancient Greeks actually used euphemism as a euphemism itself. It meant something like to keep a holy silence.
Wait, so they're using a euphemism to talk about euphemisms? That's kind of trippy.
I know, right? Super meta. It's like saying, let's not talk about this in a really roundabout way.
So it sounds like humans have been trying to find polite ways to say things for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. Centuries, at least. And it shows how much our social norms and ideas about what's polite have changed over time.
Makes sense. But, you know, it seems like euphemisms go beyond just being polite, right?
You're totally right. It's not just about avoiding awkwardness. They can be used for all sorts of reasons.
Oh, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, sometimes it's about sensitivity, like when we're talking about difficult topics like disabilities.
Yeah, so you might use a phrase like differently abled
Yeah.
instead of something that could be hurtful.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging someone's challenges while still being respectful.
I can definitely see that. And earlier you mentioned something about mitigation.
Right. That's where euphemisms come in to soften the blow of, well, tough situations. Like, think about war. You hear the term collateral damage a lot.
Oh, yeah. But that's really talking about civilian casualties, right?
Right. Unfortunately, yes. It kind of creates this distance from the real human cost of conflict.
It's like using softer language somehow makes the reality easier to swallow.
In a way, yeah.
Think-
But that kind of leads into the potential for euphemisms to be, well, a little manipulative.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. Like, someone could use them to twist the truth, make something sound better than it is.
Exactly. It happens all the time in politics. Like, spin doctors might use euphemisms to downplay some scandal or mistake.
I can totally see that. Like, remember that whole Penn State situation? They used phrases like horsing around to describe what was actually really awful.
Yeah, it's a good example of how euphemisms can be used to minimize something truly terrible. Like, we're trying to make it sound less bad than it really was.
So even though they're supposed to be polite, sometimes euphemisms can be kind of harmful, right?
Definitely something to think about. It's all about being aware of how language can be used, sometimes in not so great ways.
Okay, so we've talked about good uses, bad uses. But there's this other thing you mentioned, the euphemism treadmill. What's that all about?
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting. The euphemism treadmill is this idea that euphemisms, well, they don't always stay euphemism.
What do you mean? They lose their power or something?
Kind of. Over time, the words we used to be delicate about certain topics, they can actually end up taking on the negative feelings of the words they were meant to replace.
Oh, so like even the euphemism becomes taboo.
Exactly. And then we have to come up with new W euphemisms, and the cycle keeps on spinning.
Whoa, that's wild. I never thought of it that way.
It's kind of like a linguistic game of whack-a-mole. You try to avoid one word and another one pops up in its place.
So like even the word toilet has gone through this whole cycle. We had privy, then water closet, then bathroom, and now those words can sound kind of icky too.
Perfect example. And it
Yeah.
really shows how language is constantly changing, always adapting to our social norms and what we find acceptable.
Wow, so we're always trying to find new ways to talk about uncomfortable things.
Pretty much. But it makes you wonder, are we really dealing with the underlying issues or just finding different ways to say the same things?
That's a good question. Like, are we avoiding honest conversations by hiding behind these nicer words?
Now you're getting to the heart of it. That's a big question. And it brings up some ethical stuff about euphemisms, like, sure, we want to be polite, but are we avoiding important discussions by being too careful with our words?
It's like we're tiptoeing around the hard stuff instead of just facing it head on.
Exactly. Maybe avoiding certain words actually prevents us from really understanding and addressing the issues they represent.
I never thought about it like that before. So maybe euphemisms aren't always the best solution, even if they seem polite on the surface.
It's a tough one. There's definitely a balance to be struck between being sensitive and being honest. I guess it depends on the situation and what you're trying to achieve.
I'm definitely starting to see euphemisms in a whole new light now. It's way more complex than I thought. But, before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious about some modern examples of euphemisms. Like, what are some of the ones we're using today?
Oh, we've got some fun ones for that. Remember that YouTube video we mentioned?
Oh, yeah, the fun one. What did it say?
Well, one that stuck out to me was between jobs. Like, instead of saying someone's unemployed.
Oh, yeah. Between jobs definitely sounds way more positive. Like you're just taking a break, not actually out of work.
Right. It reflects how much we, as a society, worry about being unemployed. So we use this euphemism to make it sound less permanent, like you're actively looking for your next gig.
Makes sense. And speaking of sensitive topics, they also talked about using full-figured as a more delicate way to describe someone's body type.
Yes. That's a tricky one. It's trying to be inclusive and avoid potentially offensive language about weight. But, like with all euphemisms, you could argue whether it's actually addressing the issue or just putting a nicer label on it.
So it's not always clear-cut, huh?
Yeah.
It seems like the main takeaway is to just be aware of the language we're using and what it really means.
Totally. Whether we mean to or not, our words have power, and they send messages.
You're right. And speaking of words and power, you mentioned something earlier called algospeak. What was that all about?
Oh, right. Algospeak. That's a newer one. It's basically how people are using euphemisms online to get around those censorship algorithms, the ones that flag certain content.
So it's like a way to talk about sensitive topics without getting your post taken down.
Exactly. Like, instead of using the word dead, someone might say unalive to talk about suicide online.
Wow, that's kind of clever, but also a little creepy. Like we're finding new ways to talk about the same things, even online.
It shows how language is constantly evolving, especially with all the new technology we have.
For sure. Okay, so we've gone from ancient Greece to, internet slang, all because of euphemisms. This has been really eye-opening. I'm starting to pay way more attention to how people use language.
I'm glad. Being aware of euphemisms and how they work can make you a better communicator and a more informed person overall.
Totally. But before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about how euphemisms can help us avoid awkwardness, be more sensitive, and even sometimes be manipulative.
Right. Lots of different uses.
But could it be that even when we're trying to be polite, using euphemisms actually makes it harder to have honest and open conversations about important stuff? Like, are we avoiding the real issues by using these nicer words?
That's a fantastic question, and one we should all be asking ourselves. It really challenges us to think about the potential downsides of euphemisms, even when we have good intentions.
This has been such a fascinating discussion. I'm definitely going to be more mindful of the language I use and encounter from now on.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a journey, The more we explore language, the more we learn about ourselves and the world around us.
I couldn't agree more. So, to all our listeners out there, the next time you hear a euphemism, don't just let it pass you by. Think about it. What's its purpose? What's its impact?
Yeah.
And does it align with your own values?
Maybe you'll even be inspired to come up with some euphemisms of your own. But remember, with great euphemistic power comes great responsibility.
Well said. So that's it for this part of our deep dive into the world of euphemisms. We hope you've learned something new and are ready to keep exploring the fascinating ways we use language to shape our world.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? Are we really being more sensitive, or are we just kind of covering things up with prettier words?
Right. It's like, at what point does politeness become, I don't know, maybe even harmful if we're not actually dealing with the real issues, just dancing around them with different words?
That's a really good point, and it's something we see a lot in discussions about well, pretty much anything controversial or uncomfortable, it's easier to use euphemisms to avoid saying the thing directly.
Yeah, it's almost like a defense mechanism, right? And like we use these nicer words to protect ourselves from the harsh reality of things.
I think there's definitely some truth to that, and it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes we need that buffer, that little bit of distance to process difficult information.
That makes sense. Like if someone's going through a really tough time, you don't want to just hit them with the most brutal, direct language possible. You want to be sensitive.
Exactly. But the challenge is finding that balance. Like, when is it appropriate to use a euphemism, and when does it become more important to be completely direct and honest, even if it's uncomfortable?
So it's not always clear cut, huh? There's no easy answer for when a euphemism is the right choice.
Right. It's a judgment call, and it depends on the specific situation. But I think the most important thing is to be aware of what we're doing when we use euphemisms. Like, are we using them to be genuinely sensitive, or are we using them to avoid something?
It's like we got to check our intentions, right?
Exactly. And sometimes being honest with ourselves about why we're using certain language can be pretty revealing. It can show us where we might be avoiding things or where we might need to dig a little deeper.
This is making me think a lot about how I use language in my own life. Like, am I being as honest as I could be? Or am I just hiding behind euphemisms to make things easier for myself?
Well, hey, that's the power of reflection, right? It helps us grow and be more mindful, and that's what these deep dives are all about.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the potential downsides of euphemisms, even when they're used with good intentions. But before we move on, are there any other, I don't know, maybe more positive aspects of them that we should touch on?
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to leave everyone thinking that euphemisms are all bad. They definitely have their place.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for one thing, euphemisms can be really helpful for navigating social situations. Like, they can help us avoid saying things that might be considered rude or offensive, even if we don't mean to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, there are certain topics you just don't bring up at the dinner table, right?
Exactly. And euphemisms can help us avoid those awkward conversations that might, ruin everyone's appetite.
Okay, so they can be useful for social etiquette. Anything else?
Well, they can also be really creative. Like, coming up with new euphemisms can be kind of fun, like a little word game.
Oh, yeah, I see that. It's like trying to find the most clever, roundabout way to say something.
Right. And sometimes those euphemisms end up being more memorable or impactful than the original blunt way of saying things.
So even though they might be avoiding something directly, they can still be pretty powerful in their own way.
Exactly. They can make us think about things in a different way or see them from a new perspective.
This is also fascinating. I'm really starting to appreciate the complexity of euphemisms. They're not just these simple, polite words. They have all these layers of meaning and intention behind them.
That's what makes language so interesting, right? It's constantly evolving, adapting, and reflecting who we are as a society.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with euphemisms. We've talked about their origins, their purpose, their potential downsides, and even some of their more positive aspects. What else is there to explore?
Well, I think it would be interesting to dive into some specific examples of how euphemisms are used in different contexts. Like, we talked a little bit about war and politics, but they pop up everywhere.
Oh, for sure. Like, what about in the workplace? I bet there are tons of euphemisms there.
Oh, absolutely. Like, instead of saying someone was fired, you might hear that they were let go or downsized.
Yeah, or that they're pursuing other opportunities.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding negative things. Sometimes euphemisms are used to make things sound more impressive or important.
Oh, I see that all the time. Like, instead of saying janitor, you might say sanitation engineer.
Perfect example. It's like we're trying to make every job title sound as fancy as possible.
And then there's the whole world of euphemisms around dating and relationships. Like, ghosting someone is definitely a euphemism for just disappearing without a trace.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Or what about seeing other people? That's a classic euphemism for breaking up with someone.
It's like we're trying to find ways to make even the most painful or awkward situations a little bit easier to handle.
I think that's a big part of it. Euphemisms can be a way of coping with the messiness of life.
They give us a little bit of cushioning, a little bit of distance from the things that are hard to face directly.
Exactly. And sometimes that's exactly what we need.
This has been such a great discussion. I'm really starting to see the world through euphemism-colored glasses now.
I'm glad to hear it. And remember, this is just the beginning of the exploration. There's always more to learn and more to discover about the power of language. It really is. And, it's not just about those big, serious topics either. Euphemisms pop up in everyday life all the time.
Oh, for sure. Like, what about all those euphemisms for, well, going to the bathroom? We touched on it earlier, but there's so many different ways to say it.
I know, right? It's like we're trying to find the most delicate, indirect way possible to talk about something that everyone does.
It's kind of funny when you think about it. And speaking of funny, euphemisms can be pretty humorous sometimes, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Sometimes they're so absurd or over the top that you can't help but laugh.
Like, have you ever heard someone say vertically challenged instead of short?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. It's like we're trying to make it sound like a superpower or something.
It's so silly, but I guess it's a way of lightening the mood, right?
Yeah,
Like, instead of just saying someone is short, we're trying to find a more playful way to describe it.
exactly. And sometimes those humorous euphemisms can be more memorable or effective than just saying things directly.
So even though they might be avoiding the truth in some way, they could still be pretty powerful communication tools.
Definitely. It all comes back to intention and context. Like, are you using a euphemism to be genuinely kind or considerate, or are you using it to manipulate or deceive someone?
It's like we got to be responsible with our
Yeah.
euphemisms, right?
Absolutely. Words have power, and we should use them wisely.
I think we all learned a lot about that today. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to euphemisms from now on.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning of the exploration. There's always more to learn about language and how it shapes our world.
So true. Well, I think that about wraps it up for our deep dive into the wonderful world of euphemisms. We've covered a lot of ground today, from their ancient origins to their modern-day uses and everything in between.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as much as we have.
I hope so too. And remember, the next time you encounter a euphemism, don't just let it pass you by. Take a moment to think about it. What's its purpose? What's its impact? And does it align with your own values?
And hey, maybe you'll even be inspired to come up with some of your own creative euphemisms. Just remember to use them responsibly, of course.
That's right. Because as we've learned today, words have power, and euphemisms are no exception. So until next time, happy wordsmithing, everyone.